The left knows that they are losing. Hey, it's Prince of Queens, and over the past few weeks, I've been noticing in my remaining leftist social media sphere that the vote blue no matter who crowd has been shifting, or at least attempting to shift their strategy, away from trying to figure out who the best Democratic Party 2020 candidate will be by constantly ripping to shreds the ones they don't like, into encouraging people to stop attacking the various gaping flaws in each candidate, which is easy to do, and into being positive because they know there's a morale problem. However, before I get into that, I want to apologize for not gathering my thoughts consistently enough to make as much content as I'd like, as I've been having a lot of financial troubles which will continue until the summer. As until then, due to complicated circumstances, I'm legally unable to dip into my own savings, and thus, I need to shill myself. The best way to donate will be on PayPal, and if you want to sign up to sponsor me on Subscribestar, that's an option too. I just need money to get through late July, and I'm very deeply hoping to be able to raise and hold on to enough money to pin down my reservations at the ICMI conference in Chicago so that I can finally meet in person a bunch of friends in the male issue sphere, in particular my co-host Spacepan, whom I've never actually met in person, as well as the hosts, the Honey Badgers, who are wonderful people, and others to be determined. Please think about what you can do. That said, taking a bunch of time to think without writing excessively has allowed me to both converse with and properly analyze the state of the left more than I have in several months. And the most worthwhile thing for me to say right now is that the left seems to almost unanimously know they are losing, and their current strategy on a social level now seems to be less about advocating for anything much specific and more about damage control regarding the attacks coming from within their own political demographic. Of all of the political and cultural predictions I've ever made, the one that has been most consistently proven accurate time and time again, and increasingly so with every month, is my prediction that, if given time, the contemporary left will always eat itself by way of what I call starving piranha syndrome. Philosophically, I think it comes from a very obvious place. The absolute root source of the left's cultural influence is Marxist feminism, which supersedes all other influences in the left, because intersectional feminism and Marxism together is about one molecule away from a full-on faith-based religion, though instead of the hopeful utopian vision that communism once promised, the left now ultimately realizes that the communist dream is impossible in the world as we know it. So, instead, they point fingers at people who they believe stand in the way of that dream, including other leftists. Normally, that's some combination of rich people as a whole, white people as a whole, men as a whole, conservatives, libertarians, nationalists, and capitalists. But of course, since the left knows as little about their ideological and political adversaries as anybody possibly could, due to deliberate silencing and refusal to cater to conversations with opposing viewpoints, it becomes a game of the far left relentlessly attacking the low-hanging fruit that they call liberals. Increasingly, as time has gone on, the people the left identifies as liberals, who seemingly unanimously identify as progressives anyway, simply end up trying and failing to please the haters, or merely defend themselves, which also doesn't really work because the only solution the left will be happy with is stripping these people of all power and demanding that they stop taking up space, so that the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortezes and Nikita Olivers of the world can take over.
Our team is living the lives of the people that we're talking about representing. We're not just purporting to represent those interests. We represent them because we live them.
Nikita Oliver says her campaign is really about a movement called the Seattle People's Party.
If we're going to be a government by the people and for the people, a lot more of the people should have the opportunity to be public servants.
All of this is going to be the single most damaging thing to the political left, ahead of anything that conservatives, centrists, and right-of-center people could possibly inflict upon them. You see, the left has already conditioned its crowd to shut out non-progressive arguments entirely, and assume they are all inherently lies, But this leaves them entirely vulnerable to potent attacks from within, and there have been ample in recent years, and they will not stop.
Officers of color, and even the new black police commissioner of Boston of color are racist. Do you feel it is beneficial as a federal representative to blanketly claim the entire justice system, and I mean like blanketly, and the hardworking Americans that serve in that capacity are racist?
So thanks, Wesley. I appreciate your asking the question. Did you listen to the interview? Did you actually see the interview?
I did, yes.
Well, if you did, then you know.
Now, don't be confused. This pattern of the left coming after literally everybody, including each other, was instigated mainly during the Obama administration, which will probably go down in history as the pinnacle of far leftism that a presidential administration will ever be after World War II. At least for maybe the next 50 years. Honestly, Obama was most effective at lying constantly, while also destroying our national economy to carry out his own agenda. While he honestly didn't do a single meaningful thing that will go down in history as bettering our nation, he did succeed in legalizing government-funded propaganda and convincing a likely majority of our nation that he had fixed the economy. At least for a short while, people are starting to wake up. Thus, he and the propaganda web in mainstream media and the leftist blogosphere were thus given the task of trying to ensure that their followers continue to stay true believers in his glory and the glory of the rest of the DNC, while coming up with ever-expanding ways to shut out reality by censoring it on a media-wide level, as well as with a person-to-person block your racist family members on Facebook type of mentality that was proliferated culturally. And the left fell for it hook, line, and sinker. I speculate that the honest truth is that Obama's PR advisors like David Brock of Media Matters and I guess George Soros, who is his mentor or whatever, truly believed that they had some sort of full monopoly of news and cultural media, being that they underestimated simple memes and YouTube's true power until it was far too late. And so, they must have instead focused on purifying the leftist bubbles by trying to isolate the true believers from anybody who could talk sense into them. Thus, call-out culture became perpetuated as the gold standard of social etiquette during the second half of Obama's term, as people were encouraged to see racism and misogyny whenever they looked at their own shadows, which thus made finding these bigotries incredibly easy to do if you thought that way, even when there was nobody racist, transphobic, or misogynistic around, which thus made leftists completely vulnerable to this treatment because they were the low-hanging fruit.
We're the same. My point was we are the same. There's an entire show called ID Channel, a network dedicated 24 hours a day to women getting abused, murdered, sexualized, and violated. And you are too, sister.
And trans
it's
women
the
go through
same.
domestic violence, and you do nothing for them. Trans women are in men's prisons, and what have you done for them?
What have you done for women?
Lots of things.
I've done lots of things too. You don't know my life. Don't sit down. Sit down.
I would know about the low-hanging fruit who were attacked. I was one of those people. I once called myself a progressive, if for no other reason than the fact that the word sounded good, and people weren't using the word liberal so often to describe the cultural values of the core of the left during the Obama era. Honestly, as much as intersectional Marxist types would try to have you believe this, the left revolves around the Democratic Party, even though the ideological values perpetuated by the Democratic Party simultaneously demonize the Nancy Pelosi's and Hillary Clintons among them. The Democratic Party is the biggest force in the world that shapes the culture of the left, but once it's created, that culture that is, it's pretty hard to control. That was probably Obama's biggest strategic mistake by itself, having his propaganda army encourage the true believers of their political voting base to think they were against the exact thing that his own party was the quintessential representation of: corporate crony capitalism. On the one hand, they know that the corporations and Democrats don't do much for trans women of color, but they also know that Trump must be worse because people they respect said so.
I stood next to a woman yesterday, as I have all week, who supported Hillary Clinton. who opposes this fascist regime. I think Hillary Clinton's a war criminal. I would never support her, but I was proud and happy to stand next to a Hillary supporter, a Bernie supporter. I'm out here with by any means necessary today. I'm out here as a revolutionary communist willing to unite with anybody who's standing up against fascism. If you don't agree with me, we can have an argument, but if you want to deny the humanity of black people, you want to ban a whole religion.
Still, while that strategy clearly didn't work well enough to get Hillary Clinton elected in 2016, it did instill quite the fighting spirit into the left, who was ready and willing to go after anybody at any time, aside from maybe bell hooks. And due to that fact, the biggest paradox of all is that they trained the true believers to attack everything that the Democrats really are: wealthy, corporate, racist, sexists. You see, it's relatively easy to undo short-term political strategies, but when the DNC managed to encourage or fully finance such obvious and god-awful propaganda like MTV's Decoded and Everyday Feminism, they created millions and millions of true believers who deeply hold racist, sexist, anti-capitalist views, who are so numerous that they cannot be deprogrammed. And so now, they behave not unlike vampiric piranhas whose head vampire has already been killed, but instead of just dying all at once like they're supposed to, they manage to live on and become zombie vampire piranhas, which is what we are dealing with now, deep in the trenches.
What's wrong? You don't like brown boys? Huh? What's wrong? You don't like brown boys? What's the matter?
We're not welcome.
Stay away. Don't fucking touch anyone.
Stay away. Stay away.
Don't touch me.
Don't touch me. Don't touch me. Don't touch me.
That's two.
Don't touch me.
I got 2 more.
Now, from what I can only assume, the Democrats and their handlers were at least smart enough to know that this would probably happen after they weaponized half of the population as relentlessly bigoted, selfish, and aimless true believers, which I can only assume is one of the reasons they decided to go all in into the Russiagate hoax, because they knew it would take a miracle for them to recover from this grave miscalculation of losing to Trump, as he both hates them and understands them because he was once an insider. They did no less than attempt to organize a coup, hoping for one last chance to take back control of our nation by any means necessary, so that they could finish what they started in terms of taking full control of the airwaves, including the internet, and tyrannical policies in every level of government that would be the equivalent of university campus kangaroo courts times 10. But since what anybody should have seen as a 1 in a million chance ended up failing with Russiagate, the hopes and the dreams of the Trump derangement syndrome Putin puppet believing crowd is now starting to have to face reality, where even if they still hold on to believing some beyond miraculous conspiracy theory that will get the Democrats a victory, they are finally faced with the reality that they won't get to click their heels, say there's no place like home, and teleport back to the nationwide safe space that was 2012 through 2016. And then, of course, they begin to realize what they are left with. Other leftists, forced to actually acknowledge the increasingly right-wing ideas that have been growing in popularity in our nation, after they held on to the most self-destructive way of viewing things imaginable for as long as they could. The idea that they'd never once have to debate the people whose opinions are starting to shape our society. Now, if these people had dignity, self-respect, and integrity, they'd approach the conversation with an open mind, eager to learn about what is becoming a very popular cultural narrative, that capitalism is the best system we've got, that America was founded with the best values of any nation, and that white men might not be worth discounting entirely for simply creating the prosperous world that they happen to be unhappy with. Unfortunately, unlike myself when I first began to truly introspect about my leftist beliefs in late 2015, these people are rather weak-minded individuals, so instead, they spend almost all of their time spent speaking about politics, pointing fingers at whichever Democratic politician, media persona, or problematic person around them is up to, as if attacking Pete Buttigieg for running white and male strengthens their party. Honestly, these true believers don't know the first thing about anything besides weakening those they oppose at any given time, which usually is based around their gender and skin color. And since they have no great leaders to speak of that anybody actually listens to, the zombie piranha syndrome is in full effect. I swear, Dr. Ford would have likely been the biggest shot at becoming the Democratic Party nominee if she ran, simply because leftists actually think of her as stunning and brave still. Regardless, the interesting thing is that I've noticed the most experienced, die-hard Democratic Party supporting people in my sphere beginning to realize how much of a problem this all is. Likely due to Obama himself coming out and calling for a cease on friendly fire from within his own party. And now, I see a possible majority of their time on social media devoted to talking about calls for actual unity that goes beyond the shut up and listen to the oppressed mentality that was sold as unity for the past 6 years. Of course, not everybody has gotten the memo yet, likely because those who did don't really have any true idea where to start, and even if Democratic voters all had visions from Marx's spirit, it still would leave them without a strong leader to rally behind. Which sounds like good enough news for the time being if you're a fellow Never Democrats 2020 person like myself. But more so, the profoundly great news is that once these people finally become focused and aware of the non-stop fighting from within their own ranks, they'll soon have to start thinking deeply about the inherent problems with their very uniform ideology of intersectional feminist social justice, which will leave them open to both fairly criticizing each other for their legitimate shortcomings, as well as potentially searching for new information to further their own knowledge about the shortcoming of their peers. And who better to help educate them about this stuff than centrist political channels like myself, especially ones who came from the left, as we've been doing this for years. I mean, seriously, now that the Russiagate hoax is basically rolling the credits and they all realize the full effects of their infighting, how much longer can they ignore us when a guy like myself has been talking about starving piranha syndrome for well over 2 years now? Assuming they magically get past my shadow bans and find my content. Now that we're where we are culturally, how would you convince a feminist who truly believes that Trump won due to rampant toxic masculinity in our culture to vote for creepy Uncle Joe? How would you convince a hardcore Black Lives Matter activist to get behind tough on crime Kamala Hairspray, especially knowing that her ancestors of the half of her that is black were apparently slave owners? You see, when you train your voters to prioritize identity politics ahead of basically anything, like, actual substantive policy issues, not only will they inevitably understand very little about policy, but these voters will be easily manipulated by the dastardly deeds of the politician's ancestors, or even by just the ways the politician lovingly caresses young girls. Because, of course, seemingly the only person who was immune to such criticisms was Barack Obama. And I think that's really because the guy might have sent a drone over your house or something if you talk too much crap about him.